Now I am honored and excited to introduce our first guest on stage, David Crosier, coordinator at Eurydice, a network within the EU. Welcome to the stage. And David, welcome to Sweden and Malmö. You will have a speech under the quite long headline, Setting the Scene, Recognition of Prior Learning, Inclusion and Alternative Study Paths in the Bologna Implementation Report. So welcome, the stage is yours.
Good afternoon, thank you, Tobias. Okay, actually I was, well, first of all, I'd like to say a very big thank you to Anders and to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to come here. Actually, it's not just something I think of as a professional obligation here. I think it's the topic that we're talking about is something which affects us not just professionally, but very much personally. And I think for that reason, it's a very important issue to be addressing, and I feel very honored to have been asked to talk about our report. But I was also asked to see if you've got your red and green cards, and to test out if you can work out how to use them. So I'm going to just, before I start, ask you a question. Anders actually gave a hint that things might not be looking completely rosy in terms of how European countries are responding to recognition of prior learning. But what I'm going to be talking about in my presentation is what we found out for the 2015 report that informed the Yerevan conference. So, so what I would like to ask you is, do you think that more countries than 5 or fewer than 5 made significant progress between 2012 and 2015? So if you think the answer is more than 5 made progress to implement some procedures related to recognition of prior learning and improve their system in that period, then show the green card. And if you think less than 5, show the red card. I'm just testing whether you're optimists or pessimists, really. And it's quite split, isn't it? It's about a 50-50 on this one. So, but we'll see how that relates later. Okay. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about what I think is the context for our discussion. And then I'll tell you what we found about recognition of prior learning and access routes in the report, and end up with what I think are therefore the challenges and prospects that we face. So in terms of setting the scene, the first thing that I would say is that of course migration is not new. It's not new for human societies, it's not new for us. We're many of us in the room are probably migrants ourselves. Not only is it not new, but I think it's clear that people crossing borders is going to be part of our future. This is a reality which we'll be experiencing in the future. On the one hand, it's driven by the fact that we see no end to inequality in terms of rich and poor countries, and that we have plenty of unresolved political conflicts, if we just think about Middle East, for example. So it's going to be driven by those factors. These are going to happen, but it's also going to be driven, migration on the other hand, by the fact that our societies, being driven by global exchange of knowledge, will also require highly skilled migrants. So I think we have two very different types of situation, but still they ensure that migration is going to be part of our future. And I was thinking about what would be a good metaphor to think about where we stand in our thinking at European level about migration. And the thing that I came up with was a book which those of you who have children might have read to them several times. It's a story about a chameleon who tries to imitate the behavior of other animals so much that he's no longer able to act himself. And I think as a chameleon, and so he ends up not being able to catch the fly because he had acquires the attributes of other animals but loses the attributes he had as a chameleon. And I wonder if politically we're also in danger of not understanding where we are and not being able to act. And what I mean by that is I think if you look at discourse around migration, you see some very contrasted attitudes and views. We get, for example, the kind of migration being mixed up and conflated with issues related to security and terrorism. And the Hungarian leader is just one example of perhaps the worst example around at the moment. But saying things like all terrorists are migrants, which apart from being untrue, is also deliberately setting a negative environment and hostility against refugees and migrants. Fortunately, there are those who are more enlightened, such as the European Commission President, who points out that those who organized attacks and perpetrated them are exactly those that the refugees are fleeing, and not the opposite. So, but we have these conflictual discourses on the relationship of migration and security. We also have a mixed up reality when we think about different policy areas, and I think it's important that we bear that in mind, because yes, in terms of higher education, we tend to be rather positive. We tend to be talking a lot in the policy meetings that I attend about the positive benefits of internationalization, student staff mobility. We hear about open, inclusive higher education as the objective, and the kind of, let's say, race to attract highly skilled migrants. So we have, in general, a policy discourse in higher education which is positive. But at the same time as that's going on, we shouldn't neglect the reality that, for example, in the immigration sphere, the kind of political discourse, even in countries which are generally relatively enlightened, can be less positive. So, so the kind of language of refugee crisis, the talk about the need for secure borders, all of these kind of issues are being outlined at the same time as the higher education policy, and this leads to some, let's say, overall tensions if you try to look at joined-up policy. We also see that our attitudes to statistics are color our thinking. So we've heard already the figure that that in 2015 and in 2016 we've had 1.3 million asylum applications into European Union countries. In some places that's used to kind of whip up a kind of moral panic. At the same time, we see that for many, it also inspires a lot of altruism and solidarity. So I think we have these issues to balance. But we should also keep this in perspective. If we take out Germany and Sweden, the rest of the EU countries have handled actually less than 2% of those asylum applications. So, so the uneven distribution of where asylum seekers are actually going is something that we have to recognize. And we should also not forget that if we think just about the Syrian conflict, the number of refugees is 10 times the amount that that have landed in Europe, and the vast majority of those are in the neighboring countries. So we tend sometimes to overlook that. So the question is, why should higher education institutions, why should we care about it? Why should we care about refugees? The first thing is that I think it's important to recognize that all migrants, whatever their reasons for arriving in a new country, they all need support. And education is a key aspect of that support. It might not be the first key aspect of the support needed, but it's certainly a key aspect. And it's in, as Anders mentioned, it's in the national self-interest to support a positive integration of newcomers into society, because the contribution will be beneficial to society and the economy if the hospitality is right and the conditions are right. Overall, the benefits will play out in the longer term. It's also a waste of talent, and this is where very much rejoining the kind of arguments for RPL, for example, in general. It's a waste of talent if we undervalue the educational attainment that refugees and migrants come to bring to our societies. So if we undervalue them and underqualify them, simply because, for example, they don't speak the language when they arrive, or they aren't able to produce documents, if we do those things and ignore their real value and real qualifications, that's going to waste their talent and mean that the society is not able to benefit from it. So the appropriate response would be to try to identify the support needed and provide it. So let's look now a little bit at what we see in place across Europe. And in our report, first of all, we have also some data, statistical data about, it's limited and maybe not the most precise data, because in definitions of, picking up definitions of migrants that carry across European countries is actually a difficult task. But the data which is quite clear is between native-born and foreign-born students and graduates. And I'll just show you one slide which gives you, it shows essentially the relative chances if you're born in a country compared to if you're foreign-born of acquiring a higher education qualification. And essentially what you see is that everywhere the chances are much higher for the native-born than for the foreign-born. In some cases, like Greece, it's quite dramatic. Greece is close to 6 times more likely to get a higher education qualification if you're born in Greece than if you come to Greece. In other countries, it's much less, but everywhere where there's statistical data, your chances are higher if you're born in the country. So there is work to do if we don't believe that there is a kind of native propensity to succeed in higher education. It means that something's not working right in terms of integration. One thing that's important also to point out is that in terms of monitoring the status of people who have migrant status, actually in higher education we're not doing a very good job at that. So of the 47 countries which are part of the Bologna process, only 13 monitor migrant status of students at entry or at graduation, so pick up data on that. And of those 13, it's only 8 which monitor both at the entry and graduation point. So there are plenty of reasons why institutions and countries may decide not to monitor whether somebody has a migrant status. It's a sensitive topic. But nonetheless, if you want to see if measures are working and if they're having an impact, you need to have some kind of information to understand what's happening. So monitoring is a topic which I think is important to think about. And then it's also interesting to look at which countries have different possibilities to access higher education. So not simply the main route whereby you start with your school leaving certificate or your higher education institutional examination, but are there other ways to access higher education, other things in place to support other, and here we're not thinking about migrants necessarily, but just other people in society who may not have achieved the upper secondary school qualification for some reason. What we see is there are 22 systems that have at least one such route, but that means quite a lot which don't. But when they do, there's often little data on how many candidates actually go through that route. The few countries that have the data show relatively relatively a small share of students actually entering higher education through an alternative route. Several countries less than 1%. Norway, Netherlands, Germany, Andorra, and France 1 to 3%. And the two countries which are the outliers where where there are alternative routes with significant numbers, above 10%, are Ireland and Malta. And the other thing, if you look at this mapped on the map, the alternative routes where they exist, you also see quite a north and northwest as opposed to southeast kind of divide in countries. And that's important for a reason which I'm going to talk about in a second, which is related to demography. But I'll just move on to recognition of prior learning first, because to give you the information here. And first of all, it is a disappointing picture, as we already established. So 28 systems, it's not possible to enter higher education through recognition of prior learning. So that's quite a significant number. We're down when there's 47, now 48. So in 9 systems, it's possible in some institutions or some types of institutions, and in 11 systems, it's possible in all. So it's quite a small proportion of Europe overall. So it's possible in all, and it's a legal right in some of those systems. The picture for progression is a little bit more positive. So you can see that even if you can't enter on the basis of prior learning, sometimes you can have your prior learning used within the institution to be granted some credit, so you don't need to repeat things which you've learnt through other means. But now we come to the answer for the red and the green cards, because this is putting it all together. We have a scorecard indicator showing the different stages of recognition of prior learning. Again, you see this marked split between the kind of trend which is the north and west, as opposed to the Eastern Europe. But overall, it's a picture of slow progress. What you probably can't read very clearly is that the dark green, so where the systems are really fully in place, that's the same number of countries in 2015 as it was in 2012. So there's been no movement of systems into that situation where RPL is fully developed as part of the system. And if you look at the rest of it, there is some movement. It's actually 5 countries which have moved. So I was giving you a bit of a trick question because the answer was 5. But still, as I said, it was a test of whether you're positive or negative. So, but we're seeing slow progress, and that's the important point, that we need to think about that and try and step things up, and that was the reason for these issues being highlighted in the Yerevan communique. In terms of what we're going to look at ahead in next year's conference for ministers, there are some new aspects which we're trying to establish as to move forward a little bit. One is on looking particularly at the situation regarding refugees, and whether there's an article of the Lisbon Recognition Convention which specifically requires action to have recognition procedures in place for qualifications held by refugees and displaced people. So so we're going to be looking to see whether that is being implemented in national systems or not. We're also going to be trying to get through the Eurostudent project, which is looking at as a student survey, so a wide European level student survey. We're going to look at their data because they've asked questions specifically asking on whether the students have been admitted into higher education on the basis of RPL, or whether they've used RPL for progression. So we'll have some data which goes a bit further next time on looking at how widely RPL is being used. And we're also asking countries whether there is guidance to institutions on how to implement recognition of prior learning. So wherever the guidance may come from, has something been thought through to guide institutions in this topic. So we'll have some more and hopefully better data to bring after 2018. So the conclusions of this, for me, is that, first of all, despite being part of the policy agenda, recognition of prior learning has not advanced dramatically in many countries. The second one, that now is a good moment not only to support migrants and refugees, but also to respond to demographic challenges. The issue that I highlighted, that recognition of prior learning is very much in place in North and Western Europe and not in Eastern Europe, is particularly dramatic because if you look at demographic data, it's a lot the countries of Central and Eastern Europe which are losing people from at the age of coming out of secondary education now. So there's a demographic decline in the traditional age cohort for higher education. And one of the ways that could be compensated for is if more lifelong learning were being put in place, lifelong learning opportunities were being put in place in those countries. But actually, it's the countries where there's the biggest need for recognition of prior learning and which are actually not responding at a system level up until now. So there's a particular issue for Central and Eastern European countries to think about in relation to their demographic challenges and the social inclusion. And then the third point, which is also one which I think has been already mentioned, is that we need to be doing a better job, I think, in gathering information and sharing good practice at national and European level. So I think it's the way to advance on this agenda is to really look at what works, and try to share experience in a positive way. So those are my conclusions, and I just also want to finish with a quotation which I think is important to bear in mind. It's not a recent quotation, this one. This was Hobsbawm, the historian, who said a quarter of a century ago, "Ethnic communities and groups in modern societies are fated to coexist, whatever the rhetoric which dreams of a return to an unmixed nation." And I think we should bear that in mind in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, David. There is actually time for the audience to enter the floor with at least one question. So raise your hand if you want to ask a question. And if you are shy, I can start. In the survey Anders told us about earlier on, among the participants in this room, they did not describe any major differences in how to, when they were supposed to describe challenges when it comes to recognition of prior learning. There were no major differences between refugees and general public. What's your thoughts on that?
I tend to agree. I think the only issue that clearly is substantially different is the language issue. So the fact that refugees are likely to be in a situation where they need support to learn the language before, in order to have their qualifications and their prior experience recognized. Otherwise, the issue is about dealing with lack of documentation, but finding appropriate ways to compensate for the lack of documentation. So, and I think again, there's a lot that can be done on the basis of assessing competence and trust in what people are saying. And I think that applies for whether you're talking about mature student entering into on the basis of their prior work experience, entering higher education, or whether it applies to somebody coming from another country for whatever difficult reasons. So I think there is no substantial difference in approach.
Okay. Did we have a question? Yes, we take the question. Do you have a microphone? It's being rushed up. And please tell us who you are and what kind of question you have.
Thank you. My name is Ariadne Stojanidou. I come from Aristotle University, Greece. So I do represent one of those countries in Central Eastern Europe who are losing young people, young Greeks, and they're also receiving hundreds of thousands of young people from refugees or immigrants. We do recognize the challenge. We do recognize the need to go through a recognition of prior learning. Actually, we do have a program right now. We leave some leaflets outside with the University of Köln and the University of Amsterdam, working on it. But the real issue is that we cannot motivate the immigrants themselves because they see Greece as a temporary place for moving northern and western. So I think this is the big challenge for these kinds of programs right now. Thank you.
Okay, David?
Well, I think that's a valid and important commentary from Greece. I mean, it's, so I don't have anything to respond particularly to that. I think it's true that the circumstances in different countries are very particular, and clearly that's the reality that Greece has been facing, that it's been a transit point for many newly arrived migrants and refugees, indeed.
We have another question. Please tell us who you are.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Anne-Klaas Schilder. I'm from Stenden University in the Netherlands, in the northern of the Netherlands. And referring to your quotes from Orbán and from Juncker, I can see those diverse opinions. But the thing is, I don't think we should be naive either. That's the whole point of migrants and motivations to move somewhere along the optimistic, intrinsic feelings. You know, we should also be realistic about things which are also going on, agendas from governments anywhere, and that's the political, that's the true, the fact behind things. But it should not be either one or the other. That's what I'm saying. And within the discussions, I think most of us are very optimistic and driven intrinsically to move these people further in their lives, but that's not the whole story.
David, any comments on that?
Well, my point was simply to point out that there are these different discourses and different attitudes in society. So, I mean, I'm not, I of course have my own personal views on things, but I'm not trying to present a personal agenda. I'm just simply saying there are a lot of more positive and more negative discourses. We have a reality that migration, refugee situations are going to be part of our future. It's up to us how to shape our response. That's my point, and we see different possibilities in the political arena now, and also differences between whether we're talking about one policy area or another. And that's all I wanted to bring into the discussion as a context feature.
Mm-hmm. A warm applause for David Crosier.
Thank you.
And David, you will also be given a token of gratitude. It's a book with recipes from Sweden, and it's about Swedish food culture. So, thank you.
Thank you.